Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for getting up early on a Sunday morning to come and listen to Geraldine and I talk. I'm sure Geraldine needs no introduction, but she is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and writer of non-fiction too, and she's the author of 9 books, I think, and the latest of which is Horse, which is what we will ostensibly be talking about, but I'll range across lots of different things from Geraldine's career. I guess Horse could maybe best be described, just for context in case anyone hasn't read it, as kind of a triple thread novel where there's a key thing that unites the separate threads, which are set across different time periods, one in the 1850s, one in the 1950s, one in the present day, and the linking thing is a famous horse, a racing horse called Lexington. So Geraldine, it's such a treat for me to get to be able to talk to you as a fan. I remember reading Foreign Correspondence when I was a foreign correspondent myself, and then that sent me backwards to go back to your first book, 9 Parts of Desire, and then once I'd caught up, then I've just been on the chronological Geraldine Brooks track, and then of course that sent me into a Tony Horwitz deep dive as well, and so I was a big fan of Confederates in the Attic. Geraldine's late husband was a wonderful writer as well, so basically your long-time stalker finally has you where she wants you.
Well, it's mutual. So
this is a very obvious question to start with, but nonetheless I think readers always like to hear it answered, which is, where did the idea for Horse come from?
So I grew up in inner city Sydney in the inner west, and there weren't a lot of horses. The only horses we ever saw were the mounted police. And that was a bit of a mixed blessing, because for my mother, the sound of the mounted police outside was the signal for her to grab the dustpan and broom and run into Burwood Road to get manure for her rose bushes, which became increasingly mortifying as I got older. But so I didn't fantasize about horses, and it was never a thing. What I fantasized about was being a newspaper reporter, and luckily I got hired as a cadet by the Sydney Morning Herald, and I'd gone to university and studied things that I thought a reporter needed to know, so I did a double major in government and fine arts. And when they hired me, I was so happy, and then they sent me to the sports department. And my job was assisting the racing writers. And so, but it wasn't like I really saw the horses, because my head was down the whole time taking down details for the racing riders about the odds and things like that, just masses and masses of small details. And the only time that my head came up was to see some horrible accident, when everything drew to a halt while they came onto the track and euthanized the horse. And I never wanted to go anywhere near the races again. I had complete PTSD about it. And then years passed, and I leave journalism and become a novelist, and I'm at a writer's retreat in Santa Fe, and it's on a ranch, and there are beautiful Appaloosa and paint horses in the corral, and I'm looking at them and admiring them, and the wrangler says, you should come on a trail ride. And I said, I can't ride. And he said, yeah, you can ride these horses. They know their job. They won't let you fall off. And I went with him, and it was an ecstatic experience. And I came home, and a couple of days later, a young friend was over, and I was telling her how much I'd loved this experience on horseback. And she looked out the window and said, you've got a couple of acres. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse. A free horse.
Horses are never free.
There were so many questions I should have answered. This horse was particularly not free because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But I didn't care because the horse was beautiful, and I knew that. How? Because this horse had been featured in a commercial in Mexico. So, beautiful Palomino mare galloping across the Mexican Altiplano. Voiceover. Oh, I forgot to tell you, it was an ad for a fast-acting cream to treat vaginal yeast infections. So the mare is galloping across the plain, and the voiceover is, some things should be fast. Anyway, I get this horse, and it's all I want to think about, and I'm getting absolutely no work done. And this free horse is costing me a fortune. You know, we had to fence half the property, and once you've got a horse, you've also got the farrier and the saddle fitter and the horse masseur and the horse intuitive and the riding lessons. And so there's all this money going out the door and absolutely nothing coming in because I'm doing no writing. And then I go to this lunch for donors at a nearby museum. And at the lunch is a guy from the Smithsonian, and he's regaling the table with this story about how he's just delivered the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the American 19th century from a forgotten corner of an attic in the Natural History Museum in Washington to pride of place as the centerpiece of an exhibition on the history of the thoroughbred in Kentucky, because this horse was responsible for Kentucky being the center of thoroughbred breeding. My salad is uneaten. My donors have not a scintilla of my attention. I knew that I had my next book. So it's a bit of a stem winder, but that's the truth. That's how I got the idea.
And so then once you have that kernel of the idea, where do you go next?
Well, then, you know, it's my 6th historical novel, and I just dive into find out everything I can about this horse. And lucky me, because racing was such an obsession in the American 19th century, there were 3 newspapers devoted only to that. So every hoof print this horse ever made has been documented. But the first thing I find out is this horse had a formerly enslaved black trainer. This horse had an enslaved jockey. This horse had an enslaved groom. And this whole edifice of this thoroughbred racing industry, this national obsession, is built on the plundered labor and skills of enslaved black people. And suddenly I'm not just writing about a racehorse, I'm writing about race in America.
Well, that obviously at the moment there's such a big debate around about who gets to tell what stories. Did it give you pause once you discovered that that was?
Yeah, I was terrified, actually. I don't want to walk into a swirling blade Twitter threshing machine. And it was right at the height of that discussion. And I believe, I am not Lionel Shriver. I did not come on the stage wearing a sombrero picking a fight over this. I think it was an essential discussion. And it was overdue and necessary about where are the black voices in our literature? Where are the black gatekeepers in publishing? It was the most blindingly white industry for centuries, and certainly until this discussion burst onto the scene with the Black Lives Matter protests. And it's only now, that things are, we have, as, white people held onto the conch for way too long. So I was in 2 minds, but, I thought about, okay, the other way I could tell this story is just center it on the white owners of the horse, and there are 3, and they're fascinating people. One of them was a gynecologist who happened to be Mary Todd Lincoln's family gynecologist, and the second one was this louche riverboat gambler from a very esteemed and wealthy New York family whose forebears had all been heroes of the American Revolution, and he's sent in due course to West Point, where he promptly punches out his superior officer and gets disowned by his family, makes a fortune gambling and buys a racetrack in New Orleans. These were colorful guys. I could have written about them, but I realized that to do that would be to erase the contribution of the black horseman again. And I thought it would be better to unearth as much as I could their lives and their significance. And so I just decided to, do it and do the work, basically. I had a long conversation with Marlon James, who's a fabulous Jamaican, born, now living in America, novelist. And he said, with books where there's an issue of appropriation, usually the appropriation's the least offensive thing. There's so much more offensive going on in terms of not doing the work and not getting it right. So he said, if you're going to do this, do the work. So that's what I tried to do.
So you mentioned there were 3 newspapers of the era that focused purely on the racing industry, but also you mentioned, of course, it's operating on indentured labour. So
enslaved, which is worse. Yeah.
So did they? Did the newspapers of the day actually, because of course the gatekeepers of that are white men, was there any information in that about the people who were working in the racing industry, or where did you find that?
Not a lot, but certainly some, because they were so important that you couldn't actually ignore them. So there were references to the greatest black trainers, there were references to the greatest black jockeys, and often it's very agonizing to read, because one of the longest articles about a black jockey is, isn't this astonishing how much they paid for him, And so you could find them there. Often they were not, often there was more attention to the white jockeys than to the black. But they were there, and then they're there most stunningly to me, because I'd read a lot of correspondence between enslavers for one of my previous books, and usually when they were talking about the enslaved, they are very disparaging and sarcastic and derogatory, but not when they're talking about the horsemen, because they rely on these men. And so when they're referring to them in correspondence with each other, there's a really deferential tone, and it's like it's highlighted in neon to me because it's so unusual.
So what were the racetracks of the era like then? Were they segregated, or how?
No, interestingly. So, I think we're all very much influenced by the images of Jim Crow when the South became totally segregated. But before the Civil War and during immediate aftermath, it was a much more integrated situation. So everybody went to the racetrack. On the riverboats, I was really curious about, so where are the enslaved sleeping? Well, they were sleeping with the other, lower class passengers. The segregation came later.
Right. So then with Lexington, was Lexington a celebrity racehorse, like, say, for an Australian reference, like Far Lap or Black Caviar or something like that?
Yes, absolutely. Such a big deal. Even after his racing career, people would make pilgrimages to see him in his old age. One of the last people who came to see him was General Custer, who trekked all the way to this Kentucky horse farm and wrote about encountering the most beautiful horse he had ever seen. And the horse is old at that point. But, he was a celebrity. And when he died, people came to see his corpse. And they built him a coffin. And if you've ever had the horrible experience of burying a horse, it's an undertaking, and to think about burying a horse in a coffin is even... Oh,
my goodness.
Yeah.
So what then, was it a comment, was his skeleton kept purely because, the horse was so famous, or was that a common thing for
No, it was this horse. So they exhumed the horse and gifted the skeleton to the Smithsonian Institution, which was a pretty young institution then, and at that time was very different from the scientific research organization it is today. It was like a cabinet of curiosities, and Lexington was in pride of place as this particular famous, beloved racehorse. But then a century passes and the horse's fame wanes, and the Smithsonian's mission changes, and they're not interested in a particular racehorse. So Lexington becomes Equus caballus, which is horse, and is in the Hall of Mammals with rabbit, deer, fox.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that the fame is just erased. It's just a specimen of the species.
Yeah.
What about in the novel, there's a device that kind of moves the plot forward, which is the character Theo discovers the cranky woman over the roads getting rid of some stuff, and there's a portrait of a horse, which is Lexington. Was that common of the era, that people would pay artists to do portraits of their horses?
Yeah, because it was pre-photography. Photography really didn't become a thing till the Civil War. And so if you wanted to document your horse, and if you're selling the stud services of your horse, as they did with Lexington for a good $1, you want people to see the horse. And so there are these beautiful equestrian portraits. But the interesting thing that I discovered was the artists, and there were really two main ones, also portrayed the black horseman. And again, they're very unusual portraits for the time, because usually if a black person turns up in a painting, they're caricatured. But these were individual portraits of respected professionals doing their job. And you can see there's a beautiful portrait of Harry Lewis, who's a character in my novel, and he's just staring almost cranky at the artist, who is interrupting his important work. Yeah.
So you mentioned, you started off by telling the anecdote about being at the lunch and that the skeleton was in the attic. So where is it now and what happened?
So now it's there's this whole room in the International Museum of the Horse in Lexington, Kentucky, and the skeleton is there in a great big Perspex case with a blow-up of one of the portraits behind him. So you can see the skeleton against the actual painting of the horse. And the whole point of the exhibition is how Kentucky became the center of thoroughbred breeding, because Lexington became the most prolific sire of champion racehorses, and every American racehorse you've ever heard of has Lexington's blood.
Wow.
Yeah.
So with a book like this where you're drawing from history, are the other characters based on real life people or reflective of real life people? How many are actually real people and how many are invention?
The historical characters, the historical spine of the book, I didn't have to really invent anyone, because there was such rich pickings in the actual people. But the closest to an invention is Jarrett, who was the horse's groom. And I know the horse had a black groom called Jarrett, he's referred to, and he also was painted, although that painting is missing. Nobody's seen it for 100 years, which is a terrible shame. I would love to see what the actual Jarrett looked like. But I know, as now a horse person, that the groom is the most important person in the horse's life. It's not the owner, it's not the trainer, it's not the jockey. The footfall that the horse recognizes when they come in the barn is the groom. You know, he or she is the one bringing the grain in the morning, bathing the legs when they're hot and tired, sleeping in the stall if the horse is sick. So that's the real bond. And so that was the person that I wanted to tell the story through.
I'm not a horse person, so how do you explain, what is it about horses that makes people feel such a deep connection and bond to them?
I think they're very sensitive. They have a kind of a very, to me, delicate psyche. So my horse and I volunteer in a program for children with autism. And it's kind of miraculous. These kids arrive and a lot of them have incredibly challenging behaviors. And they get on that horse and everything settles, because when you're on a horse, it's be here now or be on the ground real soon. It takes total focus. And then I don't volunteer in this program, but there's another program at the same therapeutic riding center for veterans with PTSD. And I talked to one of the veterans about how he said it was the most helpful therapy he'd had. And I said, why? He said, because the horse knows what it's like to be prey. And when he was in Fallujah, he felt like he was prey as well. And and to me, I've always been an animal fanatic, and it was I love dogs above all things. I wouldn't be without a dog. But the bond with a dog is so much easier because we're both predator species. We're both looking out at the world straight ahead, looking for our next meal, generally. I have a Labrador who's always looking for her next meal. Whereas the horse's eyes are in the side because they're looking all around for what's going to make them their next meal. So to forge a bond of trust and affection between a predator species and a prey species takes a lot of patience and a lot of sensitivity. So I think you learn a lot about yourself in the doing of that. And when it happens, it's kind of magical. I lean against my horse and she leans back. Oh. And it's just, lovely.
So you mentioned the historic characters that you could just kind of draw them from what was there. What about the contemporary characters?
Yeah, that was kind of really where the anxiety hit the worst, because I realized that I couldn't leave the story of racial injustice in the 19th century as if it was something that was over and done with, because clearly it wasn't. And at the time I was writing this book, it was a jackhammer of one after the other of terrible, terrible killings. Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland. The litany of names just goes on of unarmed black people killed, often by the people who are supposed to be protecting them. And so I knew that there'd have to be a reverberating story in the present day as well. And for that, I just relied on the incredible patience and generosity of black friends who shared their lived experience with me and who read early drafts. But I'm lucky because I've lived on Martha's Vineyard for, I guess it's getting on for 20 years now, and it's had a thriving black community for 100 years. So, I've been able to make close friendships in that community, and it's a privileged community. These are people who are movie stars and judges and screenwriters and household names, and yet every single one of them has a story of fear and humiliation. Wealth and education isn't going to protect you. And some people here might remember one of the stories because it made such an impact, which was the Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates, who's also got a TV program and is very well known, hauled off his own porch in handcuffs for the crime of opening his own front door because some racist saw a black man trying to get into a beautiful house and called the cops. And the cop didn't listen to him.
It's just, it's extraordinary that still happens, in 2023. You just wonder, what is it going to take for that to change?
Well, we're sitting here in the wake of the referendum. And what is it going to take for it to change? Such a small ask that was. I'm brokenhearted and perplexed.
So let me kind of broaden the discussion out a little bit about, because I think readers often are interested in the process of writing. So you mentioned the way that idea sparked at a lunch. Do you have any kind of process by which you gather ideas, jot down things that perhaps could turn into books? How do you gather all of the material that then turns into something that is a book? And how do you determine, okay, well, that's just an article, but this could be a book?
Oh, yeah, no, well, I knew this was a book because the story of the racehorse in himself was good enough, because what I left out from that lunch was when that guy got up to what happened to the horse in the Civil War. That was when I was really, book. But the process is, if it interests me, it's probably going to interest the reader. And with this one, I knew that from the beginning that it would have the historical spine of the racehorse's own story. But I was fascinated by the science around the horse's bones at the Smithsonian. And the old newspaper reporter in me loves getting up in other people's business. And so I couldn't wait to find out what is this job? Who prepares a skeleton? Who articulates it? What do scientists learn from bones? So I got to go to the Museum Support Center for the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian has all these lovely museums on the Washington Mall, but those museums contain 2% of the collection, and the rest of it is out in this huge campus in suburban Maryland, where it is building after building stacked with all the greatest treasures of human creativity and examples of every life form on the planet known, tape recordings of every language that has been spoken since the invention of recording. It's the most extraordinary place, and you're there talking to somebody about their work, and meanwhile a triceratops head is going down the corridor this way, and a Chinese 14th century painted palanquin is going that way, and your head is just going like this. But I was in the funky corner called the osteo prep lab, and the real work of cleaning bones is still done by bugs, because bugs can do it, unlike chemicals or mechanicals that would take information out of the bone. The bugs just clear the flesh away and leave the bone entirely intact. And you go in there, and the scientist puts down a carcass. And the only thing I could liken it to was buffet night for my son's high school football team.
So what, do they put it like in a glass box or something?
No, it's a cardboard box, and they let the carcass of whatever it is desiccate a bit. So it's, oh my God, the smell is about as bad as the smell can be. So you go into this very humid, bit like this, humid, warm room, and it's full of the snap and crackle of beetles eating. Oh. And they put the carcass down, and they all come for the new thing, and it's
so they just, what do they just keep beetles on premises and then just plonk them in? That's how
it's like a gigantic walk-in fridge, only warm.
Wow. So with the challenges of, I think one of the challenges for writers with material is order. And right, when you read a book like Horse, it feels, because you're just in the moment and you're reading the book, and so it feels like, oh, well, this is how it was meant to be. There was no choice. But of course, for the writer, there's choice all the time about how you structure and so forth. This book, as I mentioned, straddles the 3 different kind of eras. So how did you go about thinking about structure and how you were going to make it work to be jumping back and forth?
Yeah, no, well, it's always a bit of a risk when you do that, because you can lose your reader. Jumping, they might be very involved in one strand of the story and not give a shit about the other one, so it's a bit dicey. But so this one, I knew it would have 2 strands. I didn't know it would have 3. But I was at the Smithsonian looking into osteo prep, and a curator from the art collection got in touch and said, "We've got a portrait of your horse in our collection. Would you like to see it?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "It's not on display, but I'll take you to the study center where we keep minor works." And so there's the portrait of Lexington, very nice. And I said to her, did it come, random question, did it come at the same time as the gift of the skeleton in the 1890s? And she said, "Oh, no, that's really weird. That's really weird. It actually came way later, and it's unexpected. It came in a bequest of contemporary art from post-World War II abstract expressionist, from a feminist gallerist called Martha Jackson, who was a great proponent, early proponent of the most edgy contemporary art movements that were reshaping aesthetics. She was one of the first to appreciate de Kooning and Pollock, the first to give Bridget Riley an exhibition, coined the term op art, right at the forefront. So what's she doing with this conventional 19th century oil painting of a horse? It was the only painting like that in her bequest.
And so then did you think, oh, God, now I've got a 3rd thread? Oh. Or were you like, oh, great.
No, I'm finally going to get to use my fine arts degree.
So then what was the source? How did you find out information about her?
Oh, well, because
Martha.
she was such a pioneer, there were oral... the Smithsonian...
She wasn't alive anymore.
No, and unfortunately I just missed the chance to interview her son, who had worked with her as an adult, and he might have known why she had this, but he had just died. Right. But as I'm researching her life, which was not hard to do because she was pretty notable, and she'd done an extended oral history interview with the Smithsonian at the time of the bequest, but she didn't mention that painting, unfortunately. But she talking about how she became a gallerist, because she had initially thought she was going to be a painter, but she found she wasn't good enough. And it's a kind of common story with people who become curators. They know what's good, and they know they're not good enough, but they've got the eye. And she also had the instinct to see where art was going, which was amazing. So I forgot what I was going to say.
I was asking just the source of how you found out information about her.
Oh, yeah. Oh, then, so I didn't know why she had that painting, but I did find out that horses were absolutely crucial in her life, and she had been an equestrian, but even more significantly, her mother had been a champion equestrian and had died on horseback. And so then my novelist's imagination takes that fact and spins it.
I should have mentioned at the start of this session that there'll be time for audience questions at the end. So if anything Geraldine says, you think, oh, I'd love to know more about this or that, just keep a note because I'll come to you in probably about 15 minutes or so. So you've mentioned before you were a writer, you were a journalist. How hard or otherwise is it to throw off the shackles of journalistic convention? For example, you know, the structure being dictated by fact.
Yeah, right. They used to be,
well,
didn't
I was going to say, back in the old days,
those were the days.
Out. Yeah, that's right, exactly.
No, it was really funny because I started at the Sydney Morning Herald and I had a fabulous year and learned a lot at the National Times at the feet of the great Wendy Bacon, but most of my career was as a foreign correspondent with the Wall Street Journal. And when I went to the Wall Street Journal, I started off in Cleveland, which I think of as my first foreign assignment. But they had an absolutely set structure to a story, which was you could put your index finger on the headline, and where your thumb hit was what they called the nut graph. So you'd have an introductory anecdote, and then the nut graph would tell you, this is important, why? And here's why you should keep reading. And it went on like that. And they had like a structure for the story right down to the last line, which was the kicker. And I wasn't used to that because I remember at the Sydney Morning Herald, one time I was writing a very fraught story about a terrible accident at a coal mine, and I was really agonizing about getting, you know, doing justice to the people I'd death knocked, and the news editor's pacing behind me, and where's the story? Where's the story? And I'm just trying to end it, and he said, end it? End it? I'll end it. And he leaned over, and it was a typewriter in those days, and he goes, E-N-D, and takes it.
That's right, because it used to be in the olden days that they would just cut from the bottom, and that's why you were meant to put as much of the who, what, when, where, why in the top paragraph, because they weren't paying any attention to your beautifully crafted final line. It was just
yeah.
So what tools did you develop as a journalist that you've then been able to take into the kind of work you do now?
Mainly a lack of preciousness about writing, I don't have a lot of patience for the notion of writer's block because hairdressers don't get a block and metal press operators don't get a block. So why should writers? You go to work and you do your job, because you couldn't call up from Libya and say, I can't write about the chemical weapons factory because the muse did not arrive today. You have a very short career, and I got a lot of inspiration from something a friend who's a sculptor said when somebody asked her about her process, and she said, my process is mess art. And I love that, because you can't make art every day. You're lucky if you can make it ever, but you can make a mess every day. And it's your duty as a writer to sit there and make the best mess you can, and then you've got something to work with and to fix and to hone. And so that's the best thing, I think. And also a certain shamelessness about seeking out information. I pestered so many veterinarians all around the world trying to figure out what might have been behind this horse's ailment and what could have explained it, because back in the 1850s they weren't very sophisticated about veterinary science. And what's the wonderful thing that you learn as a journalist is people, generally speaking, love to talk to you about their job, so it's like knocking on an open door.
Particularly if it's something, say, like skeleton articulation, where probably very few people have actually come and had genuine interest and want to hear about it.
Yeah, it was really great with these vets. One of them got so involved that he took a portable ultrasound down to the Museum of the Horse and ultrasounded the skeleton to see if he could, yeah.
How often do you start writing something and then you abandon it?
Oh, very rarely. There's only one book I've given up after having done quite a bit of work on it, which was a book that was based on the life of Jane Franklin. And I learned a lot about what you need to be able to do as a novelist, and the main thing is you have to be able to access the story that that person told themselves about why they did what they did. And everybody has that story. Even I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and looks in the mirror and says, I'm an evil bastard and I'm going to immiserate people today. I think even a murderous killer from Hamas has a story he tells himself about why he's doing what he does. And it might be completely wrong and complete BS and hideous, but if you can't access that, you can't write that character. And I came up upon, Jane Franklin was the wife of the governor of then Van Diemen's Land, and she did some extraordinary things, but when there was one thing she did that I just could not get my head around, what she had told herself. And so I had to abandon that.
How closely do your finished books resemble, what you thought they might be at the start of the process on day one when you sit down and start typing?
This one, not so much. This one went in lots of directions that I didn't anticipate. Generally, because I'm working with something from the past that is a fascinating story, and it has an arc. So you're working within the structure of truth, and that's why I like historical fiction, because you don't have to work very hard on the plot. The plot's there. So I usually have an idea where it's going. It's just how am I going to get it there is more the question.
We've spoken a fair bit about your writing life, but let me ask you a bit about your reading life. Do you always have a book on the go?
Oh, tons. Yeah. No.
More than one at a time? Or?
Usually two. I've usually got a fiction and a non-fiction on the go, depending on, mood.
And so what are you reading on this trip?
Let me think. I just read Fragrant Rice, which was wonderful. And I'm just in awe of what Janet has achieved here. And Fragrant Rice being Janet's memoir of her coming to Bali. Yeah.
Can you remember, as a child, the first book you ever read? What set you on a path of loving words and language?
So I was very lucky. My parents loved books, and Saturday was the big day because we would take the bus to the closest library, which was in Enfield, and we would my sister and me and my parents would all come home with an armful of books, and they were avid readers, and they also read to us before we could read. And that was my time with my dad, was half an hour before bedtime. He would read a book that was just a little tiny bit over my head. And he did that until I got so riveted by an Enid Blyton book that he was reading to me. It was The Ring of Bells Mystery. And the half hour was up, and he was like a psychiatrist. It was like, time's up, lights out. And I just couldn't stand it, and I had to keep reading. And when he saw that I was reading by myself, he said, that's where we were going with this. You're on your own now. So.
And then what kind of a path did you follow? It's funny you say that, because Enid Blyton was also what started me on a path. And then that shifted to kind of mystery novels. But then it's amazing how you just wend your way into a reading life.
Yeah.
What path did you kind of take with that?
Oh, God help me. Enid Blyton for a long time, and then lots of other wonderful... Our school got a library, and it was the most magical thing. It was just a small room, but all these beautiful books, and so exciting, just pulling. I liked stories about children left to their own devices. I read all of Ivan Southall, and a beautiful book, I don't know the name of the author, called The Road to Agra, which was, and then, God help me, I found Leon Uris. And I didn't recognize it for what it actually was, but I then became obsessed with the Second World War and started hauling around a dog-eared copy of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and absolutely, obsessed with the history of the Jews. And I was in, I think, 5th grade, and I wrote a play about the Warsaw Ghetto, and I made the poor Lithuanian girl in our class play the Nazi.
So was that the beginning of your interest in the Middle East?
No, that came from my dad. He'd served in what was then Mandate Palestine during World War II, and he was a real lefty, and he had got absolutely enthralled by the kibbutz movement. And so he was this ardent lefty Zionist, and when the Six-Day War happened, he would look at the newspapers, and he had actually been in the kibbutzim that were in the Golan Heights and was talking about how the children's houses were being shelled, and I just got obsessed with it through his obsession.
When you wrote 9 Parts of Desire, were you still working as a journalist and doing it on the side? Or
yeah, I took a 6-month leave of absence.
Right. And then did that book allow you to then leave journalism and move full-time into writing? Or how did that come about?
No, I went right back to journalism. I loved it. You know, I didn't... Obviously, a lot of it was absolutely grueling and hard, as you know, and incredibly emotionally confronting because of the kind of work that I fell into doing, which was international crises. But I felt it was important, and I felt it was a real privilege to be in people's lives at these incredibly tough times and then write for a pretty conservative American audience, reading the Wall Street Journal, and show them the effects of US foreign policy decisions playing out in ordinary people's lives. And I would have kept doing that forever, I think, if the Nigerian secret police hadn't arrested me and thrown me in the slammer. And I'm lying on this concrete floor, and I thought, I'm 39 years old. If they keep me for any length of time, I may have blown the chance to have a family. And that was the first time it had occurred to me that that was something I wanted badly, and I better get cracking. So luckily they only kept me for 3 days.
So was that then the transition point out of journalism into full-time writing?
Well, that was when I started to realize that I better, you know. So when my son was born the year after that, and at that point it was not possible. I mean, some people do it, but it wasn't what I wanted for my kids. I wanted to give them the same kind of childhood I'd had, and my mum was always around, and I wanted to be around. And I thought, well, I need a new gig. And they're not going to think of me for, you know, celebrity profiles sitting around swimming pools with movie stars. You know, the only calls I ever got to freelance were, you know, would you go to Afghanistan? No. Got a 3-month-old. I'm not going to Afghanistan. So I needed a new gig. And the story about the village that had voluntarily quarantined itself in 1665 when bubonic plague struck. We'd stumbled on that village rambling around the English countryside, and I'd been thinking about it for 10 years, about what was that like. And, you know, I got this wonderful award, the Nita Kibble Award to encourage women writers. And I was so encouraged. So I decided that I'd take that award and buy myself some time to see if I had a novel. And I wrote 3 chapters, and I sent it to the agent who'd done my nonfiction. I didn't hear anything, and I thought, oh, she hated it, it stank. I better keep thinking about what I'm going to do to make a crust here. And then I think it was 6 weeks later, she called me and she said, I've sold your book. Then I had to write it.
Well, it is funny because, I mean, people think that, well, I guess, you know, a lot of journalists think they have a novel in them, but actually it's kind of like thinking, because you can play the piano, you can play the cello, like you got some of the tools in your toolkit, but it is not the same thing.
Yeah, no, writing the 2 nonfiction books helped a lot. I had that 6-month leave of absence, and I wasted the first 3 months because I just could not sit. And sitting is the necessary, if not the sufficient condition. Lucky for me, we were living in London at the time, and my next-door neighbour was Michael Lewis.
Oh.
And he said he would see me ambling around Hampstead in the middle of the day, and he said, you're never going to get that book written until you glue your bum to the seat. And that was really good advice.
He's a delightful human being.
Yes, he is. Yeah.
All right, let me take some audience questions. If you pop your hand up, we'll come to you. Why don't we go 1, 2, 3? I don't know if there's a mic, so why don't you just yell out? Yep. Oh, there is a mic, yes. Okay, so can we, this gentleman over here, please. I just want to pass it through.
Oh, hello, Geraldine and Leigh. Look, I listened to your interview with Richard Feidler, and he asked you a question, why did you title your book Horse and not Lexington? And I missed your answer. Wanting to know.
Just for anyone who didn't hear that, sorry, the lady would like to know, why did Geraldine title the book Horse and not Lexington?
Yeah, well, if I had have titled it Lexington, it would have been very hard to disambiguate on Google because Lexington's a town in several countries. It's just not distinctive enough. And I loved the idea that this very famous racehorse had for many years been at the Smithsonian as an example of horse. And so I thought that led to an interesting place.
Okay, what about the man here who had your hand up?
Yeah.
To what extent you consider yourself, to what degree, an historian as well as being an artist and a novelist and a fiction writer?
I would never dare, particularly in my household, to call myself a historian because my husband actually was one. I feel like I might be the gateway drug to history, that if somebody reads my novel, they might then, and that's how it worked for me. So I read a historical novel called The Persian Boy when I was about 13. It's by an English novelist, Mary Renault, and it's set in during Alexander's years of conquest, and that turned me on to ancient history in a big way because I wanted to find out more about this period that she had created. So I'm hoping that, you know, historical fiction can do that. I use a few of the tools in the historian's toolkit, but I'm not constrained as they are. So if in starting to research Lexington, everything had been known about the black horseman who cared for the horse, and if the people were as well documented as the horse himself had been, then it would have been a job for a narrative historian, not for a novelist. But I'm always looking for history where there are great big voids, and you follow the line of fact as far as you possibly can, because I've found that facts are more fascinating than anything you can invent, I think. And I think I quoted in the afterword of this, Mark Twain said, fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. And that is, I've found that to be absolutely accurate. You know, the things that actually happen are so much more fascinating than if you invented them, like the idea that a Native American Indian, born and raised in his own culture and language, mastered Latin and Greek, and sat down and graduated with the sons of John Eliot and the other Puritan colonial elite in 1665. You know, if I'd made that character up, nobody would have believed it, but it actually happened. So those are the stories that intrigue me. But then if that young man, Caleb, had kept a diary and we knew what it was like to be him in those years at Harvard College, it would be for a narrative historian to write, not a novelist, but we don't know what it was like to be him. So the only way to engage with it is through imagination.
There was a woman over here, yes.
Hi, Geraldine.
Hi.
Can you hear? Yes. Mine's a general question. I'm curious, how long did it take you to write the novel Horse? And my other question is there a new one in the pipeline at the moment we can look forward to?
So Horse took a very long time, partly because it was a complicated job, and partly because a gigantic emotional bomb went off in my life in the middle of writing it, in that my husband died suddenly. And there was a year when I could not write anything. So, yeah, I don't know, a long time, too long. Yes, there is something else in the pipeline. Next year I have a fellowship at New College at Oxford. And I love saying that because it was new in the 14th century. And I'll be researching the next book there. And in between, I'm just in the middle of finishing a short memoir. So.
Okay, other questions? There was someone over here and then a man over there as well. So let's start over here with the lady from Mudgee.
Mudgee!
Thank you. Thank you. I'm assuming from...
Just push that button again and it should hopefully... You'll see a little red light come on if you give it a sec.
No, not working.
Your love affair with horses began late in life. I'm wondering if you had have read the Billabong books and the Snowy Mountains books and the Black Beauty books.
I would never have read Black Beauty because I knew that a lot of terrible things happened to the horse. I can't, I always look at, I squint at the end to see if the animal's going to make it or not. So I'm a complete coward in that regard.
But the Australian, the fun books for Australia that Australian girls read about
I
horses.
didn't read any horsey books when I was a girl. I think because I knew in the back of my mind, we didn't have any spare money in our family, and I knew it was just beyond the ambit claim of desire. So I just sort of steered clear of that.
The gentleman there in the black shirt. Yep, right there. Yep.
And I just want to finish that thought. The funny thing is, just because they're animals, I always loved them. I always admired them. And so when I started writing historical fiction, the first couple of novels were pre-horse obsession, but there are horses in them. And now I reread that, and I'm so mortified because I didn't know what I was talking about. And the standard of horse care is entirely suboptimal in all of the books, and nobody in their right mind gallops a horse downhill.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, a little off topic for the audience, but thank you very much for all of your writing. It's been a pleasure reading it. I'm interested in what was your reference material for The Secret Chord other than the Bible?
Yeah, that was very challenging, and I'm never going to do that again. Don't go back to the Second Iron Age. Big mistake. You're working with material that shimmers between history and myth, but more heavily on the myth front. However, I was just fascinated by this as the first political biography that we have. And it's soup to nuts. We meet this guy as a child and we follow him to his deathbed. And in between, everything happens to him. So it's just, this is about King David, by the way. Second Iron Age Israel. One potsherd outside of the Bible references him. However, there's material culture from that period. So I exploited my then 10-year-old son, and we went to Israel to have the physical experiences of place and to do the things that David might have done, not the murder and adultery, I hasten to add, but things like sleeping in the desert under a goat hair tent. And I think the most revealing was herding sheep, because so many leaders in the Bible start off as shepherds, and I'm really intrigued by why this is such a great career path for future CEOs. And so my son and I spent an afternoon herding sheep in the Shephelah, which is the rising hills between the coastal plain and the mountain spine of Israel. And it was really instructive because it was a mixed herd of sheep and goats, and the person who was leading this said, "I want you to separate the sheep from the goats." This is something I had only ever done in metaphor. And I couldn't get it, but my young son figured it out. Because sheep, when you put pressure on them, they cluster together and they put their necks over each other's backs to protect from predators. But goats are more sure-footed and swift, and so they scatter. So once you realize that, you know how to separate them. And the leadership lesson there was understand those whom you wish to lead. So it was practical things like that. And I got a lot of insight. We went to Ein Gedi, where David was when he was on the run from King Saul. And my 10-year-old, very fit, athletic son was running up the hillsides, and I'm laboring behind him, panting for breath and schwitzing, and I thought, this is exactly how Saul must have felt chasing David.
Probably got time for maybe 2 more questions. So put your hand up if you want us to come to you. One down here. And then there's one behind you over there. So you can be the second one. Just give it a second. Wait. Push it. You'll see the red light come on, and then just pause a second before you touch it again.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to give anything too much away because people may not have read the book, but it is a sad ending, and
You can stop right there. You'd like to know why it goes in that?
I wondered whether you agonised over doing that because there was a moment where it could have gone either way, and I suppose without saying what happened, you thought, well, that's the way things are, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. Am I on the right track?
Okay, so there are 2 reasons without giving too much away, and one is a craft reason, and one is a personal reason. And the craft reason is when I first started writing novels, I read a wonderful essay on craft, and I can't remember, sadly, who wrote it, but the advice was, as a novelist, your job is to be pushing your protagonist's head underwater all the way through the narrative, giving them problems and hurdles. But in the end, you have to decide, are you going to sink them or let them swim? And I've always been a big fan of swim because personally, when I'm reading a book, I do not appreciate it if a novelist has encouraged me to relate to a character for 350 pages and then pushes them off a cliff on page 351. But in this case, I had 2 young male black protagonists. And I think it would have been untrue to the racial history of the United States if they both swam. So there's that. And the second reason was probably not even conscious, but as I said, I couldn't write the book for a year, and I had a half of a book, and then I came back and wrote the second half. And when my friend Michael Lewis read it, he said, I suppose you know that the second half of this book is a different book because there's grief all over it. And I think what I was going through in my own life found its way into the pages of the book.
Thank you. I actually was thinking about that when I wrote it, but thanks for saying that.
Okay, last question. I forget where the person was that I pointed to. There you are, yes.
Just wondering whether your research and your writing are concurrent or whether they're quite separate processes.
No, they go on like this because I think there's a real risk if you front load the research, you'll find out something and you'll just try and cram it in whether the story needs it or not. So I try and let the story tell me what I need to know. So I write until I don't know something, and then I go and find it out, and then I keep writing. So that's how it goes.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this session. Would you please thank the marvellous Geraldine Brooks?
And thank you, Leigh.